Daniel Caulfield sat still in the kitchen, just staring at the floor. Right in front of him was the body of his stepmother, Marianne Holt. She was dead, no doubt about it. The gun that killed her lay on the table beside him. It was the same gun his father used to keep locked away. Daniel wasn't crying. He wasn't running. He wasn't even hiding what he did. His white shirt was covered in blood, but Daniel didn't seem to care. He looked more tired than shocked, like he had already been through the worst part. The only thing he did was pick up his phone and call 911. When the operator answered, he said one sentence, "I killed my stepmother." Then he gave his address and sat back down. That was it. 8 minutes later, the police showed up. 2 officers walked in with guns ready, but Daniel didn't move. He let them cuff him without a fight. A detective was already on his way. His name was Alex Riley, one of the top homicide detectives in the state. And when he stepped into that house, he knew this case wasn't going to be as simple as it looked. Riley had seen killers who tried to lie, others who broke down in tears. But Daniel, he looked calm, too calm, the kind of calm that made Riley's instincts kick in. Something was off. People don't just shoot their stepmother and sit around waiting for the cops unless they've made peace with it or unless they think they're right. And Daniel thought he was right. That much was clear from the look on his face. But Riley didn't trust first impressions. He knew better. There was a story behind this murder, and he was going to find it. This wasn't just about pulling a trigger. It was about why. And that question would lead to one of the strangest cases he had ever worked on. If you're interested in more real crime stories like this, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an update. Detective Alex Riley wasn't new to murder cases, but something about this one pulled him in from the moment he walked through the front door. The kitchen was spotless, except for the blood. Marianne's body lay still, her hair spread across the tile like she had just collapsed. And then there was Daniel, sitting calmly in a chair like nothing had happened. No panic. No signs of regret. Riley was a quiet observer by nature. He didn't rush in with assumptions. Instead, he scanned the room slowly, the position of the body, the gun on the table, the blood splatter, the expression on Daniel's face. Every little detail mattered, and what he saw didn't quite add up. People kill out of anger, fear, or impulse. But Daniel didn't fit any of those categories. After reading Daniel his rights and watching him get taken to the station, Riley stayed behind. He took his time going through the house, room by room. He wasn't just looking for evidence, he was trying to understand the kind of life that had been lived here. Family photos were on the walls, most of them showing Daniel, his father, and Marianne smiling like any normal family. But Riley knew photos lie. Down the hallway, Riley found an office with a locked safe behind a painting, a place people usually hide money or secrets. Whatever Daniel had seen in that safe had clearly changed something in him. But Riley didn't have the full picture yet. Not even close. So he made a note to return with a search warrant. He'd get what was inside eventually. Back at the station, Riley reviewed the initial reports while waiting for the forensic team. The facts were clear. Daniel confessed to the murder. The weapon was his father's gun, but Riley had a rule: never trust a story just because it's clean. People lie to protect themselves or to protect something they believe in. And right now, Daniel's calm confession felt more like the beginning of something than the end. At the station, Detective Riley sat across from Daniel in the interview room. The silence between them felt heavy. Then, without waiting for a single question, Daniel spoke. "She's not who you think she is," he said. "Marianne Holt was never real. Her name was Martin Brown, my father's old business partner." Riley didn't flinch, but inside, the gears in his head started turning. Daniel explained that his father had started a successful investment company years ago with Martin Brown. But after a big argument, Martin disappeared in a car accident and was declared dead. A year later, Marianne appeared. She was elegant, well-spoken, and somehow won over his father completely. They got married, and suddenly, Daniel had a new stepmother. To the outside world, it looked like love. but Daniel believed it was all part of a plan. He claimed that Marianne had faked her identity, gone through gender reassignment, and returned not just to be with his father, but to take back the company, the money, and everything she believed was stolen from her. To Daniel, it wasn't just deception, it was betrayal. He believed she had fooled his father, taken over their lives, and erased the family he once knew. Riley listened without interrupting. He'd heard wild stories before, but something about this one felt different. Daniel wasn't ranting. He wasn't trying to dodge guilt. He was firm, certain, as if every word he said was the only truth that mattered. And for the first time in this case, Riley realized this wasn't just about murder. It was about identity, revenge, and a past that refused to stay buried. Daniel didn't just make claims, he backed them up with what he had found in Marianne's office. After returning home to deal with his share of the company, he had started looking for his father's will. That search led him to the hidden safe behind a painting. Inside, he found more than legal papers. What he discovered, he said, turned his entire world upside down. There were medical records showing hormone therapy and gender reassignment. Photos from years ago that clearly showed Martin Brown before the transition. Identity papers under both names. But what shocked Daniel the most was the diary, written in neat handwriting page after page, describing the process of becoming someone new. It didn't read like a scam, but Daniel refused to see it any other way. In his eyes, the diary was part of a well-planned act. He believed Marianne knew that if the truth ever came out, the diary could be used as a shield, proof of pain, proof of struggle. But Daniel thought it was fake, a backup story to protect herself. He told Riley, she didn't just become a woman. She became someone else to get revenge and take everything back. To Daniel, this wasn't about gender. It was about power, control, and years of manipulation. But Riley wasn't so sure. People lie to cover their tracks, yes, but sometimes people also hide the truth because they're afraid it won't be accepted. Riley needed more than Daniel's version. He needed to look at those documents himself. Because if there was any truth to what Daniel said, it would be buried somewhere in those pages. Detective Riley returned to the house with a warrant and headed straight to the office. Just like Daniel had described, the safe was hidden behind a painting of the ocean. Inside, he found 2 folders, a leather diary, and a stack of old photographs. It didn't take long to confirm that Marianne Holt had, in fact, once been Martin Brown, business partner to Richard Caulfield. The medical papers went back over 2 decades. Reports about gender dysphoria, notes from therapists, prescriptions for hormones, none of it looked rushed or fake. The transition wasn't sudden. It was slow, painful, and clearly personal. One folder held legal documents from the original partnership between Richard and Martin. Another held a buyout agreement after their fallout. There was no sign of a hidden scheme, just records of a broken friendship and someone trying to move on. But the diary is what caught Riley's attention most. It started with Martin's thoughts years before he vanished. The early entries were full of fear and self-doubt. He wrote about not feeling right in his own body, about not knowing how to tell Richard, his closest friend, the truth. Later pages showed a clear shift, hope, decisions, and the first steps of becoming Marianne. Riley sat quietly, reading the pages. Nothing in the diary sounded like a con artist setting up a scam. It sounded more like a person trying to become who they truly were. And as Riley closed the folder, he started to wonder, was this really about stealing a company? Or was it about a second chance at life, even if it meant risking everything? Detective Riley was starting to see a different side of the case, but Daniel's mind was already made up. Sitting in the interrogation room, he spoke with the same calm tone, but his words carried weight. He said Marianne had tricked his father, ruined their family, and replaced everything he once knew. In Daniel's eyes, she hadn't just lied, she had stolen the only version of his life that ever felt real. He talked about his childhood, about growing up with a distant father and a stepmother who always seemed too perfect. Daniel never trusted her completely, though he tried. He remembered birthdays, holidays, and family dinners, all touched by a strange feeling he couldn't explain. Now he believed that feeling had a name: deception. To him, every kind gesture, every memory had been fake. But underneath all that anger was something deeper: confusion. Daniel said he couldn't believe a person would go so far just for money or revenge. Who cuts off parts of their own body for cash? He asked Riley, shaking his head. He didn't understand gender dysphoria. He didn't want to. To him, it was just more proof that something was wrong with her. Riley didn't argue with him. Not yet. He needed more answers. But it was becoming clear that Daniel wasn't driven by greed or even hatred alone. He was driven by something more personal: pain, betrayal, and a desperate need to make sense of something that never fit his idea of family. Detective Riley wasn't the kind of man to take someone's word at face value, not even a confession. He returned to the evidence room and began reviewing everything pulled from the Caulfield house. He read through the diary again, slower this time, paying close attention to the emotions behind the words. It didn't read like someone pretending. It read like someone breaking, rebuilding, and finally learning to breathe again. The photos showed two young men, Richard and Martin, smiling outside their first office building. Business partners, yes, but there was something else in the way they stood beside each other. Something Riley had seen before: connection. The kind that doesn't show up in contracts or financial reports. It raised a question he couldn't ignore. Had Richard known the truth all along? Back in the diary, one entry stood out. Mary Ann wrote about how hard it was to tell Richard the truth. She never said she did, but she hoped he already knew. She wrote about love, not revenge. About feeling free for the first time, not about stealing anything. Riley couldn't find one line that sounded like a plan to ruin the Caulfields. Still, he needed outside confirmation. So Riley made a list of people who had been close to Richard: his lawyer, his sister, old coworkers. If there was more to the story, someone else had to know. And if they didn't, then maybe Daniel had created a theory just to protect himself from a truth he refused to accept. Either way, Riley wasn't done digging. Riley's next stop was the office of Victor Stone, the Caulfield family's longtime lawyer. Stone had been by Richard's side for over 3 decades. If anyone knew what went on behind closed doors, it was him. The man looked sharp for his age, neatly dressed, calm, but his eyes gave away a certain weight, like he had carried secrets for too long. When Riley asked about the partnership between Richard and Martin, Stone didn't dodge. He spoke of 2 young men chasing big dreams, building one of the most trusted firms in the state. But he also admitted they were different. Richard, all business and logic. Martin, more thoughtful, more emotional. It worked for a while, until it didn't. The partnership fell apart, and Martin disappeared in a crash that left no body behind. Stone hesitated when Riley brought up the topic of gender identity. At first, he was careful, measured. But when pressed, he opened up. He said Martin had been struggling, and though they didn't use the word gender dysphoria back then, the signs were there. Stone believed Richard had started to notice too. That was one reason the business fell apart: personal tension they never addressed. What surprised Riley most was what Stone said next. He didn't believe Mary Ann came back for revenge. In fact, he believed she came back because of love. Stone remembered how happy Richard looked when he introduced Mary Ann at a company event. He had peace in his eyes. Stone said quietly, "The kind you don't fake." Riley left the meeting with more questions, but he also felt something shift. Maybe this wasn't about a con. Maybe it was about something people rarely talk about: forgiveness. Detective Riley's next visit was to Olivia Caulfield, Richard's only sister. She lived on the edge of town in a quiet, well-kept home. When she opened the door, Riley could see Richard in her face, the same steady eyes, the same firm voice. She welcomed him in, poured tea, and waited for him to speak. But when he mentioned Mary Ann's real identity, she didn't look surprised. Olivia didn't hesitate. "Richard knew," she said. "He knew almost from the start." According to her, Richard figured it out early in their relationship. There were too many things that felt familiar, too many habits and small details that reminded him of Martin. But instead of walking away, Richard chose to stay. He didn't feel tricked. He felt something deeper, understanding. She told Riley that Richard once sat in that very room and admitted everything. He didn't confront Marianne. He didn't demand answers. He simply loved her, knowing who she had been. Olivia said it wasn't easy for him. Richard had been raised in a strict environment, taught to believe in certain rules. But life had changed him. Love had changed him. And that, she said, was something Daniel never understood. As Riley listened, things started falling into place. Daniel believed his father had been fooled. But the truth was, Richard had known, and he chose love anyway. That kind of truth was hard for some people to accept, especially someone like Daniel, who had built his world around control, structure, and clear lines. But life isn't always that neat. Riley knew that much for sure. Riley went back to the station with a clearer picture in his mind. The diary, the lawyer, the sister, every piece of the puzzle pointed in the same direction. Marianne hadn't fooled anyone. Richard had known who she was and loved her anyway. Now, it was time to see how Daniel would respond to the truth. Riley stepped into the holding cell with the calm but serious energy that defined him. "I talked to your aunt," Riley said, getting straight to the point. "She told me your father knew everything." He accepted it. Daniel didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists. Riley could see it, the refusal, the inner fight. "He knew?" Daniel said finally, as if the words left a bad taste. No, he wouldn't. He couldn't. But Riley saw something crack in his voice. Not anger. Something closer to fear. Riley pressed further. He mentioned the diary again, the entries full of honesty and pain. Nothing about money. Nothing about revenge. Just someone trying to live as who they truly were. But Daniel didn't budge. "That's what she wanted you to think," he muttered. "She wrote that to cover her tracks. She wanted sympathy in case someone found out." His eyes looked wild, his voice full of desperation, not certainty. To Riley, it was clear. Daniel wasn't just rejecting facts. He was trying to hold on to the version of his father he had always believed in, a father who was traditional, tough, and never would have accepted something so different. But that version was a lie, and Daniel, deep down, knew it. He just didn't want to face the reality that the person he killed wasn't a villain, but someone who had loved both him and his father with all their heart. When the trial started, the small town of Regency turned into a media storm. Reporters lined up outside the courthouse. Local people, activists, and curious strangers all showed up to witness what had now become more than just a murder case. This was a trial wrapped in controversy about identity, truth, and the deep cracks in one family. Daniel Caulfield entered the courtroom wearing a prison jumpsuit, his face pale but unreadable. Detective Riley was called to the stand first. Calm and clear, he walked the jury through every step of the investigation. He spoke about the crime scene, Daniel's confession, the safe, and the documents found inside. He explained the diary, the medical records, and the background that led him to believe that this wasn't a scam, it was a personal journey. Marianne Holt had once been Martin Brown, yes, but she wasn't pretending to be someone else. She had become who she truly was. The defense tried hard to shift the story. Daniel's lawyer painted a picture of manipulation, claiming the diary could have been planted, that everything Marianne did was calculated. They asked questions meant to create doubt. Why keep those papers in the house? Why meet Richard again at the exact charity event he sponsored? Riley answered every question the same way, with facts. Coincidences weren't proof. Motive wasn't built on guesswork. As the trial went on, more witnesses were called. Experts confirmed the medical documents were real. A psychologist explained gender dysphoria and how long Marianne had struggled before transitioning. Still, the courtroom stayed divided. To some, it was a simple case of murder. To others, it was about something much bigger. And Riley knew This wasn't just about proving Daniel's guilt. It was about helping people see the full story, no matter how hard it was to accept. Just when the trial seemed stuck between two sides of the story, something unexpected changed everything. Victor Stone, Richard Caulfield's old lawyer, quietly approached Detective Riley during a break. He handed him a sealed envelope with Daniel's name written on the front. "Richard gave this to me before he died," Stone said. "He told me to give it to Daniel if the truth ever came out." It was a letter, one that could shift the entire case. Riley gave the envelope to the judge, who allowed Daniel to read it in private before it was presented as evidence. When Daniel returned to the courtroom, his face was different. The confidence was gone. His hands were shaking slightly. For the first time since his arrest, he looked like someone unsure of everything he believed. His lawyer quickly asked for a recess. The judge agreed, sensing the moment's weight. The next morning, Daniel stood and made a quiet statement. He was no longer pleading not guilty. Instead, he admitted to second-degree murder. The courtroom was silent. No one moved, no one whispered. Daniel said he was ready to accept a plea deal. He would serve 20 years in prison, with a chance for parole after 10. The courtroom, once filled with tension, now felt heavy with something else: sadness. Riley knew the letter had done what no piece of evidence could. It had come straight from Richard himself, explaining everything. He had known Marianne's truth from the start. He had loved her, not as a victim of lies, but as someone he accepted fully. That kind of love, Riley thought, is hard for many to understand. And for Daniel, it had taken a single letter to finally break through years of denial. After the verdict was read, Daniel was given one last chance to speak. He stood up slowly, looking thinner and more worn than he had at the start of the trial. His voice was quiet, almost hard to hear at first. "I killed someone who raised me, who stood by me for years," he said. "I did it because I couldn't handle the truth, because I thought I was protecting something, but really I was running from it." Daniel admitted he didn't fully understand what it meant for someone to change their gender. He said it still confused him, but he no longer believed Marianne had planned anything evil. "She loved my father," he said, "and my father loved her back. That's the part I couldn't see before." His words weren't rehearsed. They were honest, heavy with regret and something else: shame. He didn't try to make excuses. He didn't blame anyone else. For the first time, he owned what he had done and why he had done it. "I thought I knew what it meant to be a real man," he said, "but maybe my father understood that better than I ever did." That line stayed in Riley's mind long after the courtroom emptied. Before Daniel was transferred to prison, Riley met him one last time. They didn't speak much, but Daniel handed Riley something: the same photo of Richard and Martin standing outside their first office. "He kept this," Daniel said, "all these years." It was the first time Riley saw softness in Daniel's eyes. Not forgiveness, maybe not even peace, but something close, something beginning. Months passed, but the case stayed with Detective Riley. He had worked dozens of murder investigations, but this one wasn't like the others. It wasn't just about a crime, it was about people, the lives they lived in silence, and the things they were too afraid to say. Marianne's story wasn't one of revenge. It was about becoming herself, even when the world didn't want to understand. One afternoon, Riley visited the cemetery. Marianne Holt's grave was simple, but well kept. Nearby was Richard Caulfield's headstone. Riley placed flowers on both. He stood there in silence, not as a detective, but as a man who had seen what misunderstanding and fear could do to a family. Richard had loved Marianne fully, and she had loved him in return. That truth, however painful, couldn't be erased. Back at the station, Riley received a letter from Daniel. It wasn't long, but it said enough. Daniel wrote that he was trying to understand what gender dysphoria really meant. He was reading, learning, and slowly opening his mind to things he once rejected. "I'm not there yet," he wrote, "but I'm trying. That's all I can do right now." Riley folded the letter and placed it in the case file. He knew healing wasn't quick, and not everyone gets there. But for Daniel, trying was the first step. Maybe one day he would truly understand the love his father had chosen. Or maybe he wouldn't. But at least now he was asking the right questions. And for Riley, that was enough to keep going. A new case would come tomorrow, but this one would stay with him for good.